Good morning, and I'd like to welcome you to Thornbrook Hall in Norwich, New York. I have the pleasure this morning of taking on tour Miss May Smith, who is from the Chenango County Historical Society. She is the historian with the Chenango County Museum on Rexford Street in Norwich. We're going to take you through the house this morning and tell you a little bit about what you will see in the interest of taking a biographical edition of family history. We will see a lot of different things as far as furnishings and artwork, and as we go along, May will be giving us her input as to just exactly what her familiarity is with the location and the things that she remembers seeing from her trips here in the past. May, it's nice to see you.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, and this is a wonderful opportunity. I know that I will enjoy it as everyone else will.
Well, I think it's going to be a great learning experience for both of us. Certainly me, and I'll probably be picking your brains throughout the whole thing. I think what I would like to do before we start is I'm going to give you this little bit of a biographical sketch that was, I'm sure, worked on by many different people through the years, and we found it in the house when we came. It seems to be fairly accurate, and you may see me referring to it from time to time as my recollection of a lot of the family history is just not as fresh as it needs to be, and that's because I'm so young. But anyway, off we will go, and hope that everybody will just bear with us who will see this in the future, and we'll start with this room. This was a room that was added at the very end of the lifespan of the ancestors who lived here, which were the Cook family, who settled in this area, as far as we can trace back several hundred years ago. This was a music room. Miss Adeline Cook, who was the last direct descendant of the family to live here and died in 1964 at the age of 96, was a turn-of-the-century performer of some renown in the United States and overseas. She used to use this room for studying. She was quite an accomplished pianist. This room is a Chickering concert grand that was made in Boston, Massachusetts. We think that probably especially for the family in 1864. It is a Victorian Rococo design. It's very ornate. It does have the original serial number and the date still on the piano, and it is in relatively good playing condition, although it has not had any maintenance or direct tuning in quite a few years. What we're showing you now is a ball gown that was made for Mary Adeline Eastman, who was the mother of Adeline Cook, who lived in the house at the turn of the century with Adeline's father, Walter A. Cook. The gown was an original Paris design, we think, that was made for Miss Eastman, who was a descendant and direct relative of George Cook of the Kodak family. We feel that the gown is a very good representation of some of the evening formal wear that was worn by the local gentry who spent a lot of time in the cities of Boston and New York City. We're in what was one of the family studies where most of the Cook family did most of their writing through the years. A special interest in this room is the ostrich and peacock feathers that were used to give the antiquing effect to the wet paint on the woodwork, possibly, we feel, to match up the original English oak woodwork that is in the front part of the house that you will see later, which we feel was brought from England for the main staircase and foyer. At some of the furniture in the house that was part of the family collections. This is of a special detail design that most of the Cook family members used after collecting it from different parts of the world and bringing it to the United States. Writing desk that opens from both sides, and it is a desk that could have been used in a law partner's office. We feel that Walter Cook Sr. and Walter Cook Jr. both may have used it during their law practices back in the mid to late 1800s and the turn of the century before it rested here. Here and now in what we feel was one of the family's summer dining rooms. There is an original fireplace in the room that was used as, I believe, the main cooking center of the house before they had a kitchen. You will see that in just a few moments. In front of what it was the original family's cooking stove fireplace, it has the arm where all of the utensils and the different toasters and pots and pans and heaters used to be collectively used before they had a main kitchen inside the back of the house. Interesting note in this room is the period furnishings that were collected in Europe at the turn of the century, as well as the many different types of tapestry wall coverings and the English oak dining room table, which does open up and have a capacity for seating approximately 20 people. What you're seeing are other pieces of furniture that are from the mid-19th century that we have found outdoors on sleeping porches, and we have recently moved them inside. They're drop leaf in style, and we feel that they are possibly of early Philadelphia American influence. What you're seeing here is an old family sideboard that is Victorian in style and definite Italian influence, with the indication of the carved vintage pattern or the grape and fruit influence. On the sideboard is some of the family antique silver that we have found some dates that go back as far as 1750 to 1850. Seeing now is one of a collection by George Cook, who was Miss Adeline Cook's brother. He was very well known as a portrait and landscape artist at the turn of the century. Most of these portraits are portraits that he did in a collection called Society Portraits, this in particular being of a titled English woman, Lady de Grey, as she sat in her box at Covent Garden in England. We are standing now in what was the main family dining room. The dining room table, I think it is of a combination of oak, possibly rosewood veneers. The chairs are Italian influence with their definitely Italian twisted stretcher frame design. I believe the table possibly dates back to a time of about 1850 to 1890. The cabinet that you're seeing now is a very definite Italian influence with the inlaid rosewood and tulip wood and olive wood patterns. The fretwork on the top is very definitely of English style. It was a combination of the two periods coming together during the mid-18th century. It was brought from Italy, and it's been in the house since approximately 1890. The house, as you are seeing with this piece now, the house contains 35 rooms of a very diverse cross-section of period antiques and artwork, many of which date back to hundreds of years before the Middle Ages. They were collected by the Cook family through the different generations, and they have come to rest in this house up through the 1980s. That you see here in this photograph is of Miss Mary Adeline Cook, the last Cook ancestor to live in the property. It was done when she was 16 years of age from a photograph or cabinet card that you also see in the portrait by an American portrait painter who was extremely well known and well liked for his society portraits of young American women. His name was Morgan Reese. You're seeing the main foyer from the Orleans room or the ladies' parlor of the house. Of main interest would be the wide use of the hand-woven tapestry floor coverings that you will see in many rooms, especially this room as we travel through the house, and the very light-colored, very feminine gold furnishings. Hear that from this family? A particular note about this sofa: the sofa came from the present owner's palace in Palermo, Sicily. The particular note is the hand carving on each of the front sides of the sofa of the leopard, which was the family coat of arms of the royal influence from the Italian side of the family. I think the last time I went that was one.
Look at the size of that basket. Beautiful thing. Can you imagine living here and having all the company and all your family and friends?
In this photograph is a bed that belonged to Governor William Bradford, who was the first Puritan governor of the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. He was a direct Cook ancestor, his daughter having been married to one of the patriarchs of the Cook family, Mary Bradford. The bed has been in this house approximately for the last 125 years.
One of the little nooks.
Test it off. In this photograph is what would be today considered the early forerunner of what we know as linoleum tile or of sheet linoleum. This was hand-painted artwork on canvas, and it was actually used for flooring in many rooms throughout the house. As May is looking through a closet that has still many of what were the original period gowns and clothing that were worn by several different generations of the family. We feel that many of them go back to as early as the 1850s. What you're seeing now is May is walking down and looking at some of the engravings and the paintings that are part of the art collections, and she's on her way to some of the bedrooms and the rooms that we're going to see now, most notably the Lincoln bedroom. You might want to just... Seeing in this room is an early 19th century handmade bedroom suite that was one of two identical sets, the other belonging to Abraham Lincoln, which is now in the White House in the Lincoln bedroom. This set, Abraham Lincoln, when he was meeting some of the Civil War politicians in this area back in the late 1800s, actually slept in this bed in this house at that time. It has been in the house ever since, and been used by different family members through the years. Of other special note in this room is an early 19th century antique Wedgwood pattern that belonged to the Cooks that is of special note because of its unusual color and design and the hand painting, especially with the gold leaf that is decorative of the china itself. Okay. This room was the last room that Mr. and Mrs. Crescimano being Adeline Cook, used when they would come up here and stay here in the summers many years ago. It's basically very much as it was left at that time. We've just dusted and taken the top layer off, but the furniture is also pieces of many of the collections that they have had in the house through the years. Is what was originally the family music room or ballroom back during the mid-1800s. This room also encompassed area and space behind the photographer that you cannot see that was the bedroom of Mr. and Mrs. Crescimano and other rooms in the house. Through the years it has been shortened and made a family living room where many of the people would come up after dinner and just sit and relax and listen to music. At the turn of the century it was used, however, for very many festive and gay parties and balls with many of the most prominent entertainers and politicians of the day in the United States and many international figures as well. The piano that you will see in the film in this room was made by the E.T. Hayes and Ryder Company that was at one time located on Piano Street in Norwich. It is now the site of the Norwich Eaton Pharmaceutical Company. The piano was made in approximately 1850. It is rosewood of Victorian Rococo design, and it is a boxed square grand style, and it does play. The far end of the room is of Mary Adeline Cook at the turn of the century. It was done by a very well-known American and European portrait painter, Arthur Pope, who was the mentor and collaborator of George Cook. There are several paintings of this style and quality and size in the house, several of which have already been donated to local New York museums for preservation. The upstairs art gallery that was built at the turn of the century when this wing of the house was added at the rear of the mansion. It is an area where George Cook did most of the painting that he did in his later years of landscapes, famous society people, and his easels, many of his paints, brushes, stools, and art equipment are still in the room. Many of these paintings have already been placed in local collections for preservation at area museums, and many will still go to such places in the not too distant future. Oh, I wanted to say something about him. I'm sorry.
That one's all right now.
That you see in the foreground is a portrait of Prince Giovanni del Drago, who lived in Rome and was a very close friend of Adeline and George Cook's at the turn of the century. He and his wife liked the area here so well that they bought several hundred acres on the hill behind Thornbrook Hall and built a very large, very beautiful farm. He lost interest in it very early after she became ill, and they returned to Italy, and the property was sold. The foreground, or actually the melodeon, was actually a forerunner of what today is known as the reed organ. It is of rosewood in design, and it was made by H. Carr and Company of Smyrna, New York. Seeing in this foreground is a later portrait of Adeline Cook by George Cook, the portrait of her being on the right in an ermine cape and hat that was made for her in Austria at the turn of the century. This did show her in her later years. I would say she was in her 50s. The portrait to the left was of a very good friend and acquaintance of both she and George's, Janet Hill, better known today as Janet Hill Gordon, who is a semi-retired local attorney in Norwich, New York, and at one time, I believe, she was a New York State senator. What is called the throne room now. Most of the furnishings that you see in here are original pieces of furniture that date back to the Louis periods themselves, the 14th, 15th, and 16th most principally, and you'll note the Italian influence as well. Much of the artwork that is in the room is original artwork, very few pieces by George Cook, several by many of the old 18th and 19th century masters. There is one portrait in the room that you will see when the photographer takes his shots of a Mrs. Frank Leslie, who was the force and behind the man. See in the foreground is a Mrs. Frank Leslie, who was what they called the force behind the man. It was painted by George Cook in early 1900. Mrs. Leslie was the wife of internationally known publishing magnate Frank Leslie, whose popular monthly magazine was the largest circulated magazine of its kind in the country and throughout the world at the time. Mrs. Leslie was a very close friend of George and Adeline Cook's, and she attended many of the parties here with her husband that were so well known throughout the county and throughout the state in New York society. The portrait over the chair at the right is of Prince Giovanni del Drago. The chair that you see in the rear corner belongs to Prince Vittorio Crescimano, who is the present owner and the widower of Mary Adeline Cook. It is from the Bourbon dynasties when Sicily was under independent rule with its own king and its own queen. Other masterworks as well as furnishings from Vittorio Crescimano's palazzo in Palermo, Sicily. Several of the portraits and the paintings that you see in this shot are of 16th, 17th, and 18th century masters. Some are copies by students of artists the likes of Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. This shot is a very large old antique painting in itself. We are in the process of having it authenticated. It is the Madonna of the Rosary. We believe it may very well be an original lost artwork, a 16th or 17th century work, Spanish or Italian in origin. The names Pietro Novello, if it is Italian, and Velázquez have been mentioned. If it, in fact, should be a lost Velázquez, it would bring it up closer into the 17th and possibly early 18th century. The painting that you see in this shot is entitled, is titled The Rape of Europe. We are not exactly sure, but we have some documentation that it may be an early 17th century work by an Italian artist by the name of Veronese. It has been in the home for several generations. That it was one piece that was collected by Mary Adeline Cook and her brother, and we feel was a piece that was reacquired, having been lost at one time when it was in the family many generations before she and her brother were actually born. In this shot is a 17th century Mosciardo. It is an Italian painting very much done in the style of Michelangelo and Leonardo's early studio works, Leonardo da Vinci's early studio works, that were traditionally and typically painted on marble or blue slate, as this one is painted on. This is, of course, again, the influence of the cherubs, the angels, and the Madonna, which were very typical of the work that he and Michelangelo used to do in the early 15th and 16th centuries. We are not certain, but it may very well be proved to be older than the dates that we have found so far show. The combination of things: one is a 17th century or 18th century Madonna that was part of a collection of Prince Vittorio Crescimano's, brought to this country after the time that he married Adeline Cook in the 1950s. Also in the corner stands you see a Japanese or Chinese porcelain that is very typical of an early style. This is an old piece in a somewhat rose medallion pattern, which may not be visible at this view. These have been in the family for over 100 years. See here in the family library, among all the other ancestral portraits of the family, is one of Mary Adeline Cook as a young girl of approximately 20 years of age. It is considered a masterpiece by Arthur E. Pope of Boston, Massachusetts, who was the mentor and collaborator of George E. Cook, who lived in the home. The painting itself has been compared to the early style of American and internationally known and famous portrait artist John Singer Sargent. The other paintings that you see were done by George Cook and Arthur Pope of the several different generations of the Cook family. Walter Cook Sr. to the left, Walter Cook Jr. to the right, who was Mary Adeline's father, and several of the other Cook family members. The portrait at the very end, second from the end on the right, is the portrait of Mary Eastman, who was Mary Adeline Cook and George Cook's mother. Among the many furnishings in the room are the Italian influence in the Victorian furniture, the desk, the many different period style volumes, and many of them of antique value, an incredible collection of first and second editions of New York period history. The portraits that you're seeing now are of Jenny Everett of the Boston Everetts, who was Mrs. George Cook at the turn of the century, and of a late life portrait of Mary Adeline Cook's mother, Mary Eastman, both done by George Cook. Here's north end of the house at this point. We're looking at a Victorian Rococo dressing table. It's very easy to see the influence of Queen Victoria in that her busts are very evident in the carving and the design of the piece of furniture itself. It is a very good example of the period. We are on our way through the outside door into the main courtyard, and we will be looking at the carriage. What we have here of special interest might be a very early Victorian hat stand. Unlike most of the stands of its day that were made of hand-carved wood, this one is hand-cast in iron. See in this shot is a sleigh that we believe was made in the mid-1800s. It was a family piece that they used for travel during the wintertime along the roads in and out of the driveways and the many back roads of the house itself. It took them to town, it took them to church. The original harnesses for the horses that came with this and the Victorian landau that you will see in a moment are still in the house. There is of special interest the hand carving of the runners on the sleigh that all sweep up into a gooseneck with a hand carved goose neck and face motif at the very end. What you see in this shot is a picture of the Victorian landau, a horseless carriage that was owned by the Cooks and we believe to be made by a subsidiary company that belonged to the Cooks out of New York City and London in the late 1800s. It is, of course, was of course horse-drawn with oil lanterns on either side, a separate front piece forward for the driver and an interior seat that would carry three. The family crests are engraved. The top is landau in style and does fold down like a carriage top. It does still operate. We do know that it was taken out not too long ago, approximately within the last year, and taken for a ride up and down the Country Club Road. As I mentioned earlier, the original harnesses with all of the family crests when it was made are still in the house itself, and we feel that this is very definitely a mid to late 19th century piece, and very typical of the style that was made in commemoration as a memorial after the death of Queen Victoria in England. What you see here are some exterior shots that we're taking from the central courtyard, the house actually being built in the old fort style in a square. You see the pass-through drive that goes from one side of the house to the left to the other, to where in the very old and early days, before the motor carriages of today, people used to drive in and out and unload and go into the house for the many festive parties that used to be held here. You see in the foreground, where he is scanning now, the bottom levels of what is the northeast tower, rooms that you will not see from the inside. These are actually rooms that were used by servants, and where it is believed that Louis Mueller, who was believed to be in disguise as Charles X back in the late 1800s, after the fall of the monarchies in Europe, hid as a personal friend of the Cooks, seeking refuge from them in the United States. In this shot, in the shadows, are old pot-bellied stoves that were used for cooking purposes as well as heating purposes inside the house, and in this area, which was the original outside cooking room, there is an old original slate stack fireplace and the remnants of the hand pump well where water was drawn for the purposes of preparing the family meals, which were then brought into the main house for dining. Clearly of evidence of new life and a new generation of a different species at Thornbrook Hall is this nest of newborn robins that we feel are approximately a week old. When we arrived last week, the eggs were a bright robin's egg blue and the mother was guarding them very fiercely. They're situated very lowly in a fairly new spruce Christmas tree that was planted by the caretaker. We're concluding our tour now with the photographer of Thornbrook Hall. What we're seeing now are the last final photographs of the outside of the house. All of the land area that you have seen encompassed in these photographs outside at one time consisted of part of the acreage of Thornbrook Hall, almost exceeding 2,000 acres. I think that's enough.